Hello, I'm John Sheldon. I'd like to welcome you to the SD7 Quickstart tutorial. Now in this I'm going to show you basically the quickest way I've found to get this console up and running with input channels, auxes, control groups, routing your outputs, basically getting the console up and running for a show. So hopefully by the end of this, I should have answered any major questions that we have, but if there's any further, obviously ask an instructor, ask it in lab, or even catch us whenever you can. We'd be happy to help. So please enjoy the video. So to start out, let's grab our Files tab, open up Session Structure. Now, we're not going to bother naming it right now because we're going to do that later. We got to do a couple other setup things. All we're going to do is go through and hit Default All. What that's going to do is then clear out every setting that's on the console. It's also going to auto route your input channels. Now right now there's 72 input channels, but if you need more, all you need to do is touch that channel count box, and that'll then give you the encoder to change that number. Okay, aux buses is set up right now 6 mono, 6 stereo. If we want to change those, we could. Group buses, 6 mono, 6 stereo, that's fine for me. Matrix inputs, 16. Matrix outputs, 12, that's fine for what I'm doing. Control groups have 24, that's plenty. So at this point, we're now going to restructure. It's going to ask you that all settings will return to defaults. Do I want to continue? Yes. Now once it comes back, it's going to ask you and bring up the window to save the session. I'm not going to save the session right now because there's still one more thing I need to do. If I cancel out of that save screen, I'm going to go to my Setup tab and go to the Audio I/O. Now this is the configuration for all the inputs and outputs that the console sees. So if we look on the left-hand side, we'll see the ports, the local I/O. You'll see that that populates on screen all the different in and outs that are on the back of the console. If we select Rack 1, you'll see that it is connected okay via connection MADI port 1. Now if we look at the main screen here, you'll see that it is seeing a bunch of inputs and a bunch of outputs. Okay, we don't have all those. All right, so what we need to do is auto conform all those cards. So if we hit auto conform all, you'll then see it repopulates that rack. Now once it does that, the console is seeing all the cards that we have in that rack. So once that's done, I can close this window, and now would be the time to save, because now the console is going to save everything that the console sees at this point in this session. So I'll just go to my files, go to Save As New File, and then give it a name. Now the session title I like to use is the band name and the date. So we'll open up our dialog box. Now you can use the on-screen keyboard, or right underneath the console there's a keyboard. So you can type there as well. So we'll go band name and the date. Okay, then we'll just hit save. Okay, so now let's start talking about the inputs a little bit. Now basically what we're going to do is go through and name all the inputs as well as engage all the high passes and EQs while we're here dealing with all of our inputs. That way they're on, they're working, and we're good to go. So let's start by naming the channels. If I touch my first channel at the very top, select it, it'll then bring up my setup window. Now in the middle of this window, there's the little dialog that allows me to name that box. Now I'm just going to go through following my input list and name these channels. Now as I label the first one, if I hit the next button, it'll continue me over to the next channel. So I'm just going to go through and name all my channels real quick. Okay, now once I'm done naming channels, all I'm going to do is go through and close this dialog box. Now, like I discussed, I'm going to engage the high-pass filters and EQs. So one easy way to do this is to use the Option All button on the surface. Once I press and hold the Option All I have to do is engage that high-pass filter. It will then turn them on in the whole layer. Now if I hit the EQ on, it'll do the same thing. Now I've engaged all the high-pass filters and EQs. Now up next, we're going to start talking about outputs a little bit. Now with our outputs, we're going to set up a bunch of different ones. I'm going to show you how to use a few of them for a few different uses. But first things first, let's talk about the master bus. Now with the master bus, obviously that's going to be our stereo bus. That's what this console calls that. So where all my outputs are located is on layer 2 of the console. So by hitting my bank layer buttons, it will then flip the console over and display the different outputs of the console. Now the master bus is basically a stereo group. So if I come over to my group layer, you'll see that my first stereo group is labeled master already for me. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and patch that to a physical output on my rack. So if I touch the bottom of that window, it'll then bring up the output path selector. Now if the middle of that box, outputs, I'm going to send that to my first rack, line outputs 1 and 2. Now as I select the first one, it'll auto-select the one right after it because it is a stereo group. Once I have that patched, I can go ahead and close those windows. Now I like to just check and make sure that that's patched to my speakers, and like we show everybody, let's noise our system to verify that it works. So I'm going to come back over to layer 1 and just select a channel that I'm not using. Okay, so I'll just grab this channel here, and what I'm going to do is select its main input as pink noise. So I'm going to select main input, my port will be internal, I'm going to select the miscellaneous groups, and then select pink noise. Now I'll have pink noise on that channel. I can go ahead and close those setup windows, bring up this fader, and now if I bring up my master faders, I should hear pink noise. So up next, I'm going to start talking about the aux system and basically routing to effects engines. So this console has kind of simplified how it gets to the effects engines for us, which is great. So let's say I want to set up a reverb. So I'm going to select my first stereo aux, which is aux 7 right now, and I'm just going to tap the effects output button on the bottom of the screen. That will then bring up my presets window of my effects engines. So now as I go through, I can select inside default groups, and also if I have saved any presets, it will then load in there as well. So I'm just going to load up a real basic reverb. So I have it selected, I can close the window. Now you'll notice that the controls are located right underneath the screen, and they are color-coded to correspond with what's on screen. So I can then set timing and everything else. Now one last thing I'm going to do real quick is just name this aux. So that name will then cascade across the entire console. So I will know that aux 7 is now that reverb. So if I just tap the bottom of it, it will then bring up the name box, and I can just name that reverb. All right, so now let's start talking about getting the aux masters to a physical output patch. Now a few reasons you might need to do this is for running fold back from the front of house desk, using this console for monitors, or a lot of people like running subs off an aux. So to do this, it's fairly simple. It's basically the same way we routed the master bus to a physical output patch. Or let's say we wanted to do groups, it's all the same output patching. So we're going to come over to our aux 1 output, tap the bottom of it, go to our output selection. We're going to patch that to rack 1, line 1 through 8. Now if you notice, line 1 and 2 are already grayed out because they are being used by our master bus. So I'm going to select 3 because let's say I want to use these for my subs. Now once I have those patched, I'm just going to tap open the dialog box one more time and label this subs. That way I know across the console that this aux is for my sub output. So another thing we should discuss is using your audio subgroups for different things. Now one common practice is, let's say, routing our drums to a stereo group and then have that stereo group go to the master bus. So basically deassigning our input channels from the master bus, assigning them to the audio subgroup, and then audio subgroup to the master bus. So to do that, I'm going to flip back to my layer 1, go back to my drum channels. Now there's a couple different ways of doing this. Now either I can do it channel by channel or use the option all button. Now if I use the option all button, it's going to do it to this entire layer of channels. So that might cause a few problems. I'm going to show you how to do that way because it's fairly fast. So if I grab the option all button, tap the bottom of the channel, which is the output path routing section, select my stereo groups. I'm going to deassign it from the master bus, and I'm going to assign it to group 12, which is another stereo group. Now if you look, all our channels in this bank have been assigned to group 12. Now one problem that lies is my last 3 channels I'm not using for the drums. So I'm going to grab those channels independently and assign those back to the master bus and not in that group. Okay, so now I just have my drums going to that group. So now if I come over to that group, I then can open the output patch of that group and route it back to the master bus. Also, while I'm in the output path routing, I'm going to label this group drums. Okay. So now I have that group set to go back to the master bus. Now it's a good idea to bring that fader up. That way it's already routing back to the stereo bus for yourself. Now we've already discussed using our auxes for the effects and how to route those. I'm just going to go over that one more time. So this time I'm going to grab aux 8, press the effects output button, then assign what effect I want on that output. Now don't forget, since I'm already in here, to go ahead and label this effects so that name will cascade through. Now one thing we didn't discuss is how to get those back on input channels, right? So basically the output of that effects engine back onto an input layer, so then I can then route that to the stereo bus. So all I'm going to do is flip back to layer 1. Now I like to have an entire layer of effects returns. That way it's all in one section. I don't have to search for them later on. So I'm just going to grab my lowest layer of input channels. Now I have pink noise on the first channel, so I'll just go ahead and leave that there. That way I have pink noise somewhere. And I'm going to grab my first channel, setup, main input, internal port, effects, and inside that you'll see the signals that you've already routed into the effects engines. So one thing I'm going to do though is ripple channels, because odds are you're going to have more than one effect. So if I ripple the next 4 channels as that, it'll then patch the next 4 channels as my next effects engines. So I'll close that window, and then you'll notice it is now labeled those 4 channels as those inputs. Okay, now let's start talking about the graphic EQs a little bit. Now the graphic EQs are available to be patched into any processor channel. So that can be your inputs, your matrices, your auxes, you know, if you're running monitors on the console, groups. So basically with groups, I'm going to stick with that for a second and patch one across my master bus. Now, when we go to patch that, you've got insert A or insert B. So pre-EQ dynamic or post-EQ in dynamics. So for this, I'm going to patch on the insert A patch point. So I'm just going to tap my insert A. It's going to bring up a patch window. If I tap the insert A send, it brings up a routing window. Now, first things first, I'm going to tap send plus return. That will patch the return off the same patch point that the send is. So I'm going to tap the internal ports, graphic EQs, and select graphic EQ1. It'll automatically patch graphic EQ2 because it is a stereo group. And I'll go ahead and close that window. Now we just want to make sure in the selected channel strip that I engage insert A on that channel. So it will then look at those patch points. So now I'm going to come over to my master screen and open up the graphic EQs. Right, if I look at graphic EQ1, you'll see its source is now master left. If I look at graphic EQ2, you'll see the source is master right. So it would be real handy to maybe have those two gangs, so any adjustment I make on one will affect both of those graphic EQs together. So to start out, I'm just going to hit build gang, and then I'll just tap on the other one, and now you'll see that they are lit up the same color, showing that they are in the same gang. So now any adjustment I make on those graphic EQs will adjust both of those together. Okay, now let's move on to a major tool of the console, the control groups. Now the control groups can be set up basically in 3 different modes. So you've got a VCA mode, a mute group mode, or a moving fader mode. The console defaults with the control group in the VCA mode, and that's odds are what you're going to be using these for most of the time. So I like to open up and assign from my master screen. So if I just tap control groups, it brings up the assignment window. If I tap join leave on whatever control group I want to assign to, now I'm in the assignment mode. So now all I have to do is basically tap the LCD button on any channel, and it will then assign it to whichever control group I am in the join leave mode. So I'm going to set up a little drum control group. So I'm just going to go ahead and select my drums, get out of my join leave, and now I have the drums on control group 1. Now one thing I like to do too is to name that control group while I'm already here. Now if I wanted to change the mode of this control group, because like I said, right now it's just in the VCA mode, I need to go down to my layer 2 and select my control groups. Now once I have that control group, you'll see control group 1, you'll see the members, another join leave button, a clear button, as well as right now it's displaying VCA style. If I press that again, it will change the mode. So now it's mute only. Again, it will be moving fader mode. If I press it one more time, it'll flip back over to VCA style. So depending on how you plan on using your control groups, that would be how you'd alter the mode of the control groups. I just want to thank you for your time watching the quick start for the SD7. I hope it's been informative. And once again, if there's any further questions about the console or its uses, don't hesitate to bring them to us and ask us. So once again, thank you for your time. Take care.